We're going to now move to the second criteria for revenue recognition, and that is that the fee needs to be fixed and determinable. We have a overall guiding principle in U.S. revenue recognition. It's a conservative principle, and it says that we never want to recognize more revenue in a period than we're ultimately going to receive. So we don't want to find ourselves in the situation where we recognize revenue in one accounting period and in subsequent accounting periods discover that we're not going to receive that full amount and have to reduce the revenue that we previously recognized in a future period. Accordingly, we have this principle that says we only recognize the certain fee that we know we're going to receive, and we call that the fixed and determinable fee. So we look at the contract amount and we say, is this subject to change? Is there anything that could happen that would result in a discount to the customer, a refund, a penalty? Are there acceptance terms that says if the customer doesn't agree that it meets the specifications, they can return it or they don't have to pay for it? Are there any other deliverables that we might have to make if things don't turn out the way they are expected to? Do we need to provide some additional services? Are the fees non-refundable? And is that clearly stated in the contract? Are there any contract contingencies, things like penalties? Are there bonuses? Are there any terms or conditions that would say if this happens, the fee changes? Well, if there are, we need to think about those and take them into account when we do our revenue recognition. And our principle is we only want to recognize the certain amount, the known or fixed fee from the arrangement. If there's any reason why we might recognize less, we want to net those reasons out and only recognize the full amount that we know we're going to receive. And then if in a subsequent period those contingencies are resolved and we do get to recognize the revenue, then we'd recognize those in the future periods. Typically we do that by deferring the revenue. Even if we invoice the full amount and collect it from the customer, if there's any conditions which could result in us refunding that to them or providing some sort of credit or additional deliverables or additional services, we want to defer the amount that would relate to any of those contingencies, any of those refunds, any of those penalties, any of those other items that we'd have to deliver to the customer, and just recognize the net amount, the amount that we know is certain, the amount that's fixed and determinable. So it's a very important concept, and as I said, it's part of this conservative approach in U.S. revenue recognition, in U.S. GAAP, that says we don't want to find ourselves in future periods making adjustments to revenue that we've previously recognized. We don't want to have negative revenue in the future. We think it would be better to recognize less revenue now, and then when we know we're certain that we recognize the balance of the revenue in the future when there's resolution as to those events that could reduce the amount of revenue. So it's a very, very important concept, and we often come across situations where we're trying to evaluate a transaction for revenue recognition where we go, is the fee fixed and determinable? Or what is the amount of the fee that is fixed and determinable? Sometimes we'll find that the whole fee may not be fixed and determinable, and we'll need to defer the entire amount of the transaction. Other times it might be a specific portion of the fee. So there might be a penalty of 10% if the product or service doesn't meet certain criteria. Well, in that case, we just recognize the 90% that was certain, and we defer the 10% that was uncertain. If the entire fee was uncertain because it hasn't been accepted or it might be refunded in its entirety, well, then we would defer the entire amount of the transaction until such future time as the revenue became certain, that the revenue became fixed and determined. Another consideration in this fixed and determinable concept, and one that's sometimes hard for people to understand and grasp, is the question excuse me, of whether the fees are extended. So the customer may not be willing to make the payments when they become due. This is a separate consideration from our collectability criteria that we'll look at shortly, the fourth general principle of revenue recognition. In the fixed and determinable criteria, we're asking the question, are the payment terms so far in the future that they're not fixed and determinable? We'll ask for additional consideration, additional terms in order to make those payments. This is something that come up particularly with technology companies, particularly with software companies where there's no incremental cost to each transaction, such that a customer who had a long period of time to pay for their software license, maintenance might say, well, I owe you this money, but I'd like the newer version, and it doesn't cost you anything, so why don't you provide that to me? And so the general bright line is that anything that's over 1 year between the delivery of the product or the service and the payment should be thought about as to whether it truly is fixed and determinable. Anytime you have a normal payment term that is exceeded by the payment terms of a transaction, you should probably take the time to consider whether it is an extended payment term and whether the fee truly is fixed and determinable. So if your normal terms are 30 days and you've got a transaction with a customer that has 270-day payment terms, you need to at least think about whether you're going to collect the full amount from that transaction or whether there's some uncertainty about whether you'll collect the full amount. If you determine that there is some uncertainty, or what people would say is you're in the extended payment terms situation, then you're going to recognize the revenue as the payments become due or as the payments are made, rather than on a full accrual basis. So this would be a situation that we'll see as in the collectability section, where you'd be recognizing on a cash basis because there's some uncertainty as to whether the fee is fixed and determinable. And this often interfaces with the collectability section. You can look at it either way, but if the fees aren't fixed and determinable, if there's some reason why, even though contractually the customer is obligated to pay the full amount, but they would be able but unwilling to make that payment because of the passage of time, and things can happen, well, then you may need to recognize the revenue as those payments become due rather than on a full accrual basis. So you might deliver the product or complete the service to the customer and wait until the payments come in to recognize the revenue. If there's uncertainty regarding whether the fee is fixed and determinable, and if that uncertainty comes from the fact that there is such a long period of time between delivery and payment that the customer can change their mind or ask for additional items. You see this a lot in the software world, you see this a lot in the technology world, where the payments are really far out in the future. Now, this should not be interpreted to say anytime you have lengthy payment terms that you recognize on a cash basis. You may be providing the service over time and the customer may be paying over time. For example, you may have a multi-year service contract associated with a product that's been delivered or with a software license that's been delivered, where they pay for 1 year increments of service. Well, since you're delivering the service over a 1 year period of time and they pay for the year 2 at the beginning of year 2, that wouldn't be necessarily an extended payment term. Or if you're, providing a service on a monthly basis and the customer is paying on a monthly basis, that wouldn't necessarily be an extended payment term. But where you've delivered the entire service or the entire product up front and the customer pays in the arrears, you need to at least consider whether you're in an extended payment term situation, because that's one thing that could make the fee not fixed and determinable. And that's the second criteria that we're looking at here in the 4 principles of revenue recognition. And as I said, the issue is not whether the customer has the ability to make the payment, but whether they would be willing to make that without additional concessions or provisions provided to them. Concessions are another consideration that could determine that the fee is not fixed and determinable. So if a company has a practice of making concessions to their customers, reducing the price, providing additional services without a compensation, that can be a serious situation with regards to revenue recognition, because it says maybe the fee isn't fixed and determinable, or maybe the evidence of the arrangement wasn't complete at the initial signing if in subsequent periods the vendor makes additional favorable terms available to the customer. So you need to be very careful about making changes to contracts that are unilateral, that only increase the value to the customer without increasing the value to the vendor. This does not mean that if you modify a contract, it's necessarily a concession, but if you make changes to a contract that benefit the customer, there should be some benefit to the vendor as well. So you need to be very careful about concessions. Finally, in the fixed and determinable fee, and then we'll go to our next polling question, there are some other situations that can impact whether the fee is fixed and determinable. For example, if there's third-party financing, where a leasing company is making the payments to the vendor and collecting payments from the customer, is there any recourse from the leasing company to the vendor where if the customer didn't pay the leasing company gets a refund or doesn't have to pay the vendor? That would be a situation that says the fee is not fixed and determinable. Now, if the vendor delivers the product to the customer and the customer pays the leasing company and the leasing company pays the vendor, and there is no contractual term that lets the leasing company get anything more from the vendor, then the fee probably would be fixed and determinable. But if there is recourse where the leasing company could be able to sell the product back to the vendor or wouldn't have to make payments or could get a refund, those would all be examples of the fee not being fixed and determinable, in which case it would be inappropriate to recognize the full fee up front. Several other situations could make the fee not fixed and determinable. Fiscal funding clauses. This is a typical contract term with governments, nonprofit agencies, governmental entities like school boards, where there's a clause in the contract that says, we're making this purchase, but it is contingent upon the budget for our organization being approved. So for a school district that has an annual budget cycle and is making a multiple year purchase from a vendor, there might be a clause that says, well, if the budget isn't approved, then this contract is null and void. That would be a clause that would impact the fixed and determinable nature of the contract. So you need to look at those. Maybe only the first year of a contract with one of these type of government agencies is fixed and determinable because they only have a one-year budget cycle. So you need to look at those kind of clauses, and sometimes they're buried back in the fine print of an arrangement, but if you don't take those into consideration and the budget doesn't get approved, the vendor wouldn't be able to collect from the customer, and if they'd recognize the full amount or more than they're actually going to collect, or they have to refund, we could have a situation where we've recognized too much revenue because the fee wasn't fixed and determinable. Finally, in our fixed and determinable section, lots of major customers ask for a most favored customer clause within a contract. These most favored customer clauses are clauses that say, I'm your best customer, I get your best price. If you sell to another customer for less, I get that price. The type of most favored customer clause that would cause us difficulty in revenue recognition would be one where the terms of that best price says if you sell to another customer for less, we get a refund for the ones that we've paid the higher price for. That would say that the fee for those previously sold items was not fixed and determinable, and therefore we shouldn't have recognized the full amount for those. If the most favored customer clause says, if you sell for less to another customer, we get that price on all our future purchases, that would not, in and of itself, cause a fixed and determinable fee issue. But if there could be a refund because we sell to someone else for less, that would be, and we may find it is very difficult to determine what the fixed and determinable amount is because we might not know what it would be possible to sell to someone in the future for, including a transaction that might result in a loss for us. So we couldn't just say, well, we'll always recognize up to cost. Any of those type of clauses can be very toxic in a contract and could preclude revenue recognition until such time as the fee is truly fixed and determinable. And that could result in revenue deferred for many periods. So the key here, the key concept is, in order for us to recognize revenue for a transaction, we need to know how much revenue to recognize. We would only recognize the amount that's fixed and determinable, the amount that's certain of collection. So let's get that next polling question up there. And the question is, how does your company recognize revenue? Do you automatically defer all revenue? Do you automatically recognize and then adjust? Do you manually review each transaction, or do you have some other approach to revenue recognition? And we have a question there as well. That is very small type, Caprice. I'm getting to be, I'm a very old man now, Can we expand that window so that, oh, there we go. So the question is, if the fee is not fixed due to extended payment terms, is revenue recognized as it becomes due or on a cash basis? Well, that's a very good question. Technically, the literature would say they recognize as it becomes due. I guess you'd have to have a high level of confidence that the payments would be made on or about the due date. Let's look at an example. So if we sold something in December and it was a $1,000 transaction and there was 1/3 due on signing, 1/3 due in 60 days, 1/3 due in 90 days. Even though the first third hadn't been paid at December 31st, technically we could recognize that 1/3 if the payment was due and we were confident that it would be paid. If we weren't confident that it would be paid, then we would probably want to recognize on a cash basis. Some companies have a conservative approach and they would say, well, we'll just recognize the revenue as we receive it on a cash basis. Others would say, no, these are good customers. They have the ability to pay. The reason why we deferred the revenue is only because it may not be fixed and determinable because the nature of the extended payments, we're confident we'll get the money, so we'll recognize the revenue as the payments were due. In my example of 1/3 due in on signing in December and 1/3 in 60 days and 1/3 in 90 days, then March 1st or 2nd, whenever the 60 days comes up, let's see, 31, 28, yeah, it'd be March 1st, would be when we recognize the second third, and then in April, when the 90 days came up, we'd recognize the third bit. You want to be careful about what the payment terms are, because if you sign something and deliver in December and the first payment's due in 15 days, that would fall in January, and you wouldn't be able to recognize the revenue at the earliest on the, say, the 15th of January. So it is a somewhat subjective situation. The revenue guidance says you recognize revenue as the payments become due, but there's a divergence of practice on that. Some companies, just to be safe, would say we'll recognize it as the cash is received, which should approximate the due dates. Otherwise, it probably wouldn't be appropriate to recognize on the due dates. Others would recognize on the due dates on the assumption that the payments are made on or about the due date. So I hope that answers the question. If you've got further questions on that, you're welcome to do a follow-up question on that, and any other questions that you might have on the fixed and determinable nature, or as we go through the webcast. Really encourage questions because it helps me understand whether you're whether I'm fully communicating what I intend to do, and just makes it a little bit more interesting. So anyway, those are our first two criteria. So the first criteria was we needed to have evidence of arrangement, the E and the CDEF. The second, the fee needs to be fixed and determinable. We need to know how much revenue to recognize for a transaction.